All right, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're jumping into a court case that really came down to a single profound question. When does life truly end? Now, this wasn't some philosophical debate in a classroom. Oh no, this was a high-stakes legal battle that would end up redefining death itself, and basically force an entire country's laws to play catch-up with modern medicine.
So get this, for a team of surgeons in Thailand, the answer to that very question could have been the difference between performing a life-saving transplant and getting a life sentence in prison. Yeah, you heard that right. Their decision to go ahead with an organ donation kicked off this massive legal firestorm that challenged the very definition of life and death in the eyes of the law.
So let's just dive right into the core of this. Pretty shocking situation. I mean, can you imagine this? You're a surgeon, you perform what you believe is a life-saving organ transplant, and the next thing you know, you're on trial for murder. Well, for this medical team, that absolute nightmare became their reality.
The prosecution's case, when you look at it, was chillingly simple. They argued that when the doctors removed the organs from two accident victims, who were referred to in the case as L and N, they weren't saving lives at all. No, they were actively and illegally causing their deaths. So in the eyes of the law, this wasn't medicine, this was homicide.
And this, as you can imagine, created this just impossible conflict. You had a grieving family on one side demanding justice, then you had a medical team on the other just acting on what they knew to be established modern scientific standards. And caught right in the middle, a legal system with a huge blind spot. It had no clear definition of death. And this put the entire future of organ donation in the country completely on the line.
So really, the whole thing boiled down to one single critical question. What does it legally mean to be dead? You know, the court's answer to this was going to decide everything. It would determine if these doctors were heroes or if they were murderers.
Okay, so you had two competing ideas here. The prosecution, they were arguing for the traditional definition of death. You know, the heart stops beating, breathing stops permanently. It's the way people have understood death for centuries. It's intuitive, right? But the doctors? They were operating based on the modern medical concept of brain death. That's where the brain has completely and irreversibly stopped all function, even if machines are keeping the heart and lungs going.
And here's a really crucial detail. This idea of brain death, it wasn't some newfangled concept the doctors just came up with on the spot. No way. The Medical Council of Thailand had actually formalized this exact definition way back in 1989, and they did it specifically to guide organ transplants. So the medical community had a clear, established standard. The problem was, the country's legal code just hadn't caught up yet. Okay, so how did the courts even begin to handle this unprecedented clash between the law and modern science? Well, the case started its long journey through the Thai justice system. The case worked its way up through three different levels of the court. First up, the court of first instance. The verdict there? Not guilty. The court actually accepted the doctor's diagnosis of brain death. But it wasn't over. The prosecution appealed, taking it to the Court of Appeals, which upheld the decision. They agreed the patients were medically dead. So this all set the stage for a final showdown at the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court.
So, the case finally lands in the Supreme Court, and the judges there, they were faced with a question that went way beyond the fate of these specific doctors. At this point, you could say the very foundation of medical law was on trial.
The whole legal argument, when you strip everything else away, boiled down to this really simple but profound question. Whose job is it to define death? Should it be lawyers and judges, or should the law defer to the expertise of medical science? I mean, the court's answer here was going to have massive implications.
And the court's reasoning was, frankly, incredibly pragmatic. In their final decision, the judges pointed out this critical gap. The Thai Criminal Code literally has no definition for the word death. It's just not in there. So, since the law itself was silent on the matter, the court decided the only logical path forward was to defer to the experts. In this case, the medical community.
And this was a huge moment, a landmark moment really. The court effectively took a medical definition and imported it directly into legal practice. What it was doing was acknowledging that as science evolves, especially in a field as complex as medicine, the law has to be willing to adapt. It has to accept the standards set by the professionals on the ground.
So, with that powerful reasoning now established, the Supreme Court was finally ready to deliver its final, binding verdict. And you can bet the entire nation's medical community was holding its breath.
The court came back and affirmed the acquittals from the lower courts, and the logic was now legally solid.
Because the patients were brain dead according to the accepted medical standard, they were already legally deceased. And, well, you can't be found guilty of murdering a person who is already dead.
But the story doesn't end there. There's a critical layer of nuance here. While the doctors were cleared of murder, they weren't exactly seen as completely faultless. A separate investigation by the Medical Council actually found that they hadn't perfectly followed every single protocol, like having a committee of at least 3 doctors confirm the brain death diagnosis.
And this is where the Supreme Court made a really vital distinction. It ruled that a professional misstep, like not following internal guidelines to the letter, that was an issue for the Medical Council to handle. It wasn't a matter for the criminal courts. A procedural error, they argued, is not the same thing as murder. The core diagnosis of brain death was medically sound, and in a murder trial, that was all that really mattered.
So the acquittal wasn't just a victory for these individual doctors. It sent these powerful ripples across both medicine and law in Thailand, and it ended up changing the entire landscape for years to come.
By setting this incredibly powerful precedent, the court gave doctors and hospitals the legal certainty they so desperately needed. It legally validated brain death as a definition of death, and that, in turn, ensured that organ donation programs could continue their life-saving work without living in fear of criminal prosecution. And that, of course, has ultimately saved countless more lives.
This case really leaves us with a powerful question for the future, doesn't it? Technology is constantly redefining the boundaries between life and death. This ruling solved one critical challenge for its time, but as medicine continues its relentless advance, you have to wonder, how will our laws and maybe even our ethics struggle to keep pace? Thanks for joining me on this explainer.